Okay, so focus bracketing, what is it? Well, it's a series of images with the focus point in a different position. The goal here is to achieve a massive depth of field. Now, this is slightly different than focus stacking, which is the software that is typically used for blending images together. And so you'll see both terms, and it's the bracketing that we're doing in the camera, kind of like we do exposure bracketing. We're going to do focus bracketing in this case, shooting a series of pictures at different areas and then kind of combining them later on in post-production. Now, the reason that we might want to do this is to increase the depth of field. We might want to increase the sharpness of a particular image, or increase control over the in-focus area. I'll have an image that I am particularly showing you that explains this very clearly in a minute. All right, so the idea is that we're going to capture slices from near to far, and these slices need to overlap so that there's sharpness between all of them, so that when they come together, it's all going to be in focus. And so once again, rather than using hyperfocal distance to get everything in focus, we're going to use multiple photos. So we know we have a limited range of depth of field, whether we focus up close or further away. Yes, we can do our hyperfocal distance, but sometimes it's just not sharp enough at the very edges of that hyperfocal distance. So what we're going to do is we're going to focus at several different points, have enough depth of field so that there's overlap between all the slices, and then combine all the slices together. So each of these is going to have a little bit of depth of field. And then we're going to take those into a software program and we're going to combine them. We're dealing with the shooting this out in the field part. We're not going to be dealing with the software part here in this particular talk. So how are we going to do this? Well, there's two different ways. Many cameras, most new cameras these days have a focus stacking capability built in. But you can also do it manually. And one of my favorite photos down in California was done manually before I had a camera that had this feature. I knew it was possible at the time, and it probably wasn't for 5 years before I had this in camera. So if you don't have this in your camera, not to worry, you can still use this out in the field yourself. Now, if you do have this feature in the camera, there is going to be some primary controls. The first is the number of exposures. How many exposures do you want to shoot? And the correct number is the fewest to get the job done. You want to make sure that the front object is in focus as well as the back object. It could be anywhere from 2 images to 1,000 images. The increments, this is how much the lens changes from one shot to the next. This is something you are definitely going to have to test with your particular camera system. I work with a lot of systems. In some cases, I generally set it at 1 and 2. In other cases, I'm setting it at 9 and 10. And so it really depends on what you shoot and a number of other variables. Now, we have a large number of apertures we could be using, but generally we want a lot of depth of field. That's what we're trying to do here in this whole process. But we also want to avoid diffraction, which is what happens when we close our lenses down to f32 and 16. So typically I'm using f8 to f11 in most of the stacking that I'm doing. All right, now there are going to be variables to all of these settings. It's going to have to do with the subject size, the distance to the subject, the focal length, aperture. So all the normal culprits that affect your depth of field are going to affect how you set your camera up and these other controls. Now, there's a few other things that you might have options. There might be a delay option. This might be handy if you're in a studio working with strobe units that need to recycle, or if there's vibrations on your camera and you just want a delay so that it's not picking up any movement of you pressing the button on the camera. Smoothing, I don't like this feature because this indicates that your camera is in some sort of automated exposure and you are shooting a series of images that are going to be combined into one image. In my mind, that means you should have your camera set to manual. If for some reason you wanted to have your camera set to automatic, this would get those images a little bit closer together in exposure. And so I don't think you'll need this. It's possible you could get some exposure changes with focus breathing on some lenses as they start focusing up very close. They start letting in less light, and that could cause a problem. The electronic shutter is a shutter without mechanical motion, which means you're less likely to get vibration or sound. It's possible that you're going to get distortions with electronic shutters, but we're focusing and we're going to be working with subjects that are not moving, so distortions are highly unlikely in this case. Now, for setting things up, you want to get your aperture set, which is going to be maximum depth of field without diffraction, and that's going to vary from lens to lens, but f8 to f11 is pretty common. You want to set up the number of exposures. A lot of time, I like to see if I can get it done in 5 or 10 shots. A lot of times I need many more than that. Increment or step size, you're just going to have to do a test, generally in the middle of the range, and then see if you need to up it or lower it depending on how the images come out. All right, so here we are in the studio. If we focus with shallow depth of field, we're obviously getting very little in focus. If we stop down, well, we don't have all of our subjects in focus. The background's very out of focus. If we focus in the middle of the scene, you might say, our foreground subject and our background subject are horribly out of focus here. Even though we're stopped down pretty close to the hyperfocal point, it's not enough to keep everything in sharp focus. In this particular case, I'm shooting at f11. I'm doing 50 shots, much more than I typically like to do, but sometimes you need to do a lot of shots. On the first image, I'm setting the camera up to focus on the nearest subject. And for cameras that have this feature built in, they tell you just to set up the camera with it focused on the nearest subject, and it will just move the lens until it runs out of shots. And so in this case, after 50 shots, I have something beyond my last subject, beyond the background in focus. When I take those into the software, I'm using Helicon software, that's Helicon software. I stack all these images up together and I get incredibly sharp focus from the foreground to the background. Now, the different focus stacking programs out there are going to have a lot of parameters for adjusting a variety of features, which is more of a talk for software. We're not going to get into it now, but this is one way of getting a subject in sharp focus from foreground to background. And it can do a much, much better job. As you can see, focus shifting on top compared to a single shot setting the hyperfocal distance. Down in Point Reyes, I found some very interesting trees, and I tried to set the hyperfocal distance in this distance here to get everything in focus. And then I decided to shoot it with a better aperture reading, like f11 or so, and adjust focus manually. And so as I adjust focus manually throughout, I ended up taking about a dozen shots, and I just kept them in my Lightroom category or catalog for about 3 or 4 years until I actually had the software to put it all together to get one nice sharp image. And if you're wondering, well, is it really worth all the time and effort? Well, it depends on the details. Let's look at the details of a focus stacked image in all its great sharpness and compare that to a single shot image. Once you get in close enough, yes, you can see a very clear difference. Shooting a subject in a single shot at f2.8 yields pretty shallow depth of field. But suppose I want the foreground and the background of the foreground leaf and the background leaf on this flower to be in focus. Well, I stop down and then I get the background in focus, which I didn't really want. By using the stacking technique, I could just keep it focused in on that little flower, but still keep that background out of focus. And so this is what I meant when I said earlier on, better control of the in-focus areas. And so if you want to keep that field of flowers in focus from the foreground to the background, yeah, try a shot at f22, see how well you do. And then if it's not too windy out and your subjects aren't moving, you can do a focus stack where you can put all of them together to get really sharp focus from foreground to background. And so it's a helpful technique, but your subjects do need to be steady. So you need to be very careful about wind and any sort of movement. Now, strangely enough, there is a couple of cameras, the Z6 and Z7, and not the Z6 II and Z7 II, that would show you a peaking stack image, which would show you how you were doing with your stacking of your images and how much you were getting in focus. So you could see in the field whether you were doing a good job at judging how many shots you needed, how much depth of field was set, is there enough images going from front to back? And why this is not included on the latest generation of Nikon Z cameras, I don't know. There is no other company that has this. It's just a quirk in time that they did this and now they took it off. So if you happen to own one of those two cameras, it's a little bonus for you. Now, if you want to do this manually yourself, you can. you're just going to need to manually focus. And what you want to do is you manually focus on the nearest point, and you're going to adjust focus just a little bit further away on sequential shots until the far point is in focus. And so you may need to do some testing out on how many images and what aperture and how far apart your focusing is on each of these to do this. Now, for a while, there was a number of tools out on the market. I'm sure they're still out there, but now that a lot of cameras have features built into them, we don't need to buy these other tools. They are out there. And if you do want to get, well, pixel peeping perfect about this, these are a little bit better than the in-camera technique. When you're moving the camera, or when you're doing it in camera, you're changing the focus of the lens, which is causing focus breathing. There's different amounts of light coming in. It's changing the magnification on your subject depending on the focus breathing. And the technically better way to do this is by moving the camera. So if you want to take this focus stacking just to the very, very highest level, then you might be interested in one of these devices. But for most of us folks, it's not going to be necessary. Now, to do this, you're obviously going to need a tripod because you got to keep that camera rock solid steady. It helps if you have a remote, and then you're going to need software later on. Now, one of the things you need to be concerned about is focus breathing. This is where there is a notable magnification difference between your lens focused at close-up and on infinity. So if you take a look at where this particular lens goes back and forth between close-up and infinity, you can see the magnification really change. And this is one that's going to be a little bit more difficult to work with in this case. And so some tips for doing this is work with non-moving subjects. Make sure your camera's on a tripod. I like being in manual exposure. Have consistent lighting. Have that aperture stop down, but not too far. And you want to frame a little bit loose because of that focus breathing in there. And so those are your tips for making this work out right. As far as the software goes, there's a number of different software that will deal with focus stacking at this point. Here are some of the most common ones and what they cost, depending on whether it's a subscription or a buy only. A few of these have different levels where you can get a basic level and a more advanced professional level, depending on how many different attributes you wanted. Okay, so there you go, folks. That is focus bracketing. We'll see if we'll take a few questions in here.
John, there's only one that's come through for this section, which is to use the in-camera function, your lens needs to have autofocus lens. Oh, and autofocus lens. And these new features will not work on a manual focus lens.
That is correct.
Yep.
Yes, absolutely need to have your autofocus lens turned into the autofocus so that the camera can control focus.